Hello again, I'm Iain McNay. I'm sitting here with John Reed, our Director of Catalogue at Cherry Red, and we're going to talk about another of our box sets. This one's a 3 CD box set, A Slight Disturbance in My Mind, the British Proto-Psychedelic Sounds of 1966. Includes bands like The Creation, The Pretty Things, The Yardbirds, The Kinks, Misunderstood, John's Children, The Hollies, etc. So John, interesting title, A Slight Disturbance in the Mind. Did you identify this at all?
Quite possibly, yeah. We all have to be slightly disturbed when we're doing these box sets. So this is the latest in a series curated by David Wells, who runs our Grapefruit label. And a few years ago, we decided, very much on a whim, to do a 3 CD compilation of the psychedelic sounds of 1967. And it was called Let's Go Down and Blow Our Minds, and it was extremely well received, and people really hooked onto this idea of just tracks from a particular year. So it's proved to be a popular concept. And then we followed with a similar 3 CD for 68, 69 and 70, and then we thought we'd do the prequel. So A Slight Disturbance in My Mind is really the first murmurings of something strange happening in British music. So, you know, as I'm sure lots of people know, in 63, 64 you had this explosion of bands spearheaded by the Beatles, the British beat boom, and then that was followed quickly by the R&B boom, which were all very much linked anyway, but this kind of British R&B boom, which then evolves into the blues scene. But in 65, with albums like the Beatles' Rubber Soul and so on, the Kinks doing See My Friends, you start getting this sense that British pop music is getting more experimental. That the acts are, they're more interested in music from abroad, they're drawing on more literary influences, they're listening to Bob Dylan, it's more cerebral. And studio techniques are improving. Bands, as the money was growing, because obviously this explosion in record sales, bands were starting to be given more freedom in the studio, and record producers, younger record producers, were starting to be a bit more creative. So in 66 really is when psychedelia arrives in August with, well, in Britain at least. In America it had already arrived in maybe late 65, but in Britain you have, in August, Revolver by the Beatles, Tomorrow Never Knows. That opens the floodgates to what follows. So what this box set is, A Slight Disturbance in My Mind, is telling that story of how these strange and marvellous sounds that followed, the first murmurings of that really.
And which bands here do you think were particularly influential in that movement on this album?
On this album, I think you've got a band like The Creation, who only really enjoyed a brief flurry of success, and it was minor, but they cottoned onto this idea of pop art, and the only other band really to talk about that were The Who, and with tracks like Paint a Man and Making Time, they sort of were at the vanguard of introducing strange sounds into their records. The guitarist used a violin bow way before Jimmy Page. The artwork and everything on the box set is sort of reflective of an advert from the band The Creation. You got a group like the Hollies, who aren't seen as pioneering in that sense, but some of their songs and the songwriting was starting to bring in Indian influences and very much more intellectual ideas in the lyrics as well. So it's not just about the music. You've got a band like the Pretty Things, who start off as a bunch of R&B roughnecks, and by 66 they're making records that are definitely unusual. So, and the Kinks, of course, were absolutely, although you don't think of the Kinks as synonymous with psychedelia, they were definitely pushing the envelope in terms of records that were strange and unusual. I mean, even records, Dead End Street, or those kinds of records, they're not traditional pop, they're not Herman's Hermits. So there's a lot on this box set that, if you're a fan of psychedelia, or even what just preceded it, this is definitely for you.
Right, so you managed to sneak the Misunderstood on here, who actually an American band.
Yeah, so Misunderstood, who obviously have a history with Cherry Red, because we did the compilation back in the day. So they were a really obscure group who, John Peel, again, who at the time was largely unknown, saw them in California, and certainly in terms of psychedelic rock, the Californians were probably a year or so ahead of the British. So Misunderstood arrive in London with a bit of a bang and get a record contract, and so they qualify. And the other person of note from across the water is Kim Fowley, who comes over to the UK. He'd made a record in late '65 referring to psychedelia, and so he'd cottoned on to this new thing that was happening in the States, and again has a kind of alchemic kind of impact on the UK scene, starts talking to bands and saying, well, you need to talk about psychedelia, you need to take drugs. There was definitely a lot of this kind of outside influence, really. But again, you listen to Misunderstood, and probably the biggest influence on them was the Yardbirds. And the Yardbirds in the UK were a highly influential band, but arguably even bigger impact in the States. So you had this all through the 60s, as through different eras, the American scene, the British scene, feeding off each other. So, yeah. So I think in '66, you've really, it's arguably the most important year in rock.
And Riot Squad are on here as well.
Yeah, Riot Squad were an interesting group, originally produced by Joe Meek, also famous for including Mitch Mitchell, who went on to be in Jimi Hendrix Experience, and at one point David Bowie as well. So again, a lot of musicians came through the ranks in these British beat bands in the 60s and went on to be famous. So there's an early David Bowie single on there, when really he's a completely unknown character.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that is so fascinating about these box sets, that it covers a period, or it covers a town, or it covers a genre, and there's so many. You've got your bigger names, and you've got your names that are just not very big, and you have to delve in and find them and read up about them if you like them. And I think it turns people on to a whole new world.
Well, I love the way David curates these box sets. He writes very detailed and colourful sleeve notes. We normally find unissued tracks. I think there are 3 or 4 tracks here that have never been out before that we found on tapes that we had in our archives. So there's always something new for people. And again, it's trying to find the balance between the landmark records by the Kinks, the Hollies, the Pretty Things, and these completely unknown groups like Outrage that no one's ever heard of before. Yeah. So it's amazing that 55 years on or so, we're still finding these little nuggets, these little gems that no one's heard. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I talk about historical A&R, and it's historical discovery, isn't it, sometimes?
Yeah, and it's just painting a picture. There are hundreds of thousands of records issued in 1966. This is just dipping our toe in the water, but it's an interesting story. And this idea of experimental pop that evolves into psychedelia, or you've got styles that people have subsequently labelled freakbeat or whatever. It is this transitional scene, really. You've also got a lot of bands who really would be defined as kind of mod groups, who were still really rooted in this kind of R&B and soul idea, but they like the action, but they're just picking up on outside influences, and the music you can hear is starting to tilt away from just a straight copy of Black American music and bringing in other stuff. It's a bit more sophisticated, it's a bit stranger, or there's something else that's happening.
Yeah. Okay, John, thanks very much.
Brilliant, thank you.